Testing, testing. This is Stefano Virgili from Vox Podcast, and today I'm going to be super confused because we have Diane and Diana, right? Diane in Nairobi and Diana in London. Hi, Diane. Hi, Diana. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Diana Paredes from, I would have said Suade, but it's actually Suede.org.
Yes. Correct.
Thank you for joining us. And I know about your startup for more than 1 year, actually. I think is or about 1 year. I met Lorenzo at the FinTech Festival in Singapore. And if I recall correctly, you were talking on stage at that time in one of the presentations. And I was confused. I'll be very frank. I don't clearly understand how it works. I know it's something along the line with GitHub, but for financial institutions. And that's why I'm so excited to get this session of the podcast going and ask you all the questions that I always wanted to ask you. But I hand it over to Diane now to continue the introduction.
Thanks, Stefano. So, Diana, I think you guys relate yourself to RAS, regulation as a service.
Yes.
So let's answer Stefano's question and tell us a bit more about Suede and the story behind the startup, the why and the how.
Yeah, sure. So effectively, my co-founder and myself, when we started the company back in 2014, we basically realized, coming from the financial industry ourselves, that there was really, I guess, like a niche of understanding in the regulation that we had from our own expertise and doing this in the industry for almost a decade, that could be turned into software. And I think it's quite interesting because fintech was just starting to be a sector at the time. In London, I think Barclays, which is the bank I was working with, was literally like running the first fintech accelerator for London. And I had not even heard of an accelerator at the time. It was kind of the first time I even heard the wording. And so what was interesting is that we realized there was an opportunity to fundamentally turn our knowledge about how to take the legislation and transform that into code and to turn that into software, right? And so I think we haven't really pivoted from the beginning. We basically had that idea set out to start building that kind of software. It's complex software, so that's maybe why Stefano was a bit confused, because it's not easy to kind of explain in like a elevator pitch of 5 minutes. It makes a lot of sense to people who are in the business that have to deal with those issues, but it's a bit more difficult to explain from like a pure, layman perspective, as is all of regulation, to be fair. But effectively, we are a RegTech. We do regulatory technology. We have basically created the most performance system in the market, so we can actually generate regulatory outputs on hundreds of millions of records in a matter of minutes, which is really exciting. And the regulatory outputs can be in the form of reports, they can be in the form of analytics, they can be in the form of calculations. And so the point that Stefano was making around GitHub is because we actually started an open source project that was basically to take regulatory data definitions and turn that into like a financial regulatory data format, if you want. So it's, on GitHub, it's open source, it's a free data dictionary, it's a public good effectively of looking at the legislation and turning that into granular data attributes, as per the way it's described in the legislation. And so what's really important to understand around that, we can talk about that in a bit more detail, is that one of the things that we have been advocating in terms of, bringing better technology to financial services is that we also need data standards for the industry. So we've been very, adamant that regulation actually is a great opportunity to create data standards. If you have good data standards, that's how you create basically good technology. We advocate interoperable systems, data that can go easily from one place to the other without being basically locked into the old school traditional enterprise software architecture. That means that the financial industry basically puts data into a system and then can never get it out. And so that's the work that Stefano was referring to, because one part of our work is basically this open source project that is not just related to the software that we create. It's broader than that, but effectively it is very focused on the concept around taking the legislation, taking advantage of the regulation to create a good data dictionary that can also generate more interoperability in our industry, and that can also make sense for people that are developers that don't need to know anything about finance in order to create technology for our sector.
Wow, that's a loaded answer. Okay, so I'm trying to put myself in your shoes here, because you're coming from a background of you worked at Barclays, you worked at Merrill Lynch, and then it was the time when the budding time for fintech in general, and then how did you get this inspiration, this that, because some people would say regulation is not sexy, but I can imagine for you, yeah, I can sense that. So what's the personal side of things? Was it you were trying to put the work that you're doing in a box, like, so in a magic box, so that and everybody can have this sort of regulation standards easily?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I still am, I guess, in DNA, a banker through and through kind of thing, right? So I saw the worst of the crisis at Merrill. I remember when I did my internship, actually, at Merrill Lynch, I had like 10 offers. I had done really well. And then in the city, people knew I was the girl with 10 offers kind of thing. So I was like really, really very happy to become someone on the trading floor. And I loved the trading floor. I really loved the buzz. I did actually like a few stints. I did foreign exchange. Then I went into liability-driven investments, and then I ended up in a piece that was more around like structured work. And so it's not so much that I wanted to leave the industry, and effectively I haven't, because I'm still selling into banks. But the thing is that I realized that for me, career-wise, I wanted to basically, have a bit more independence about what I wanted to achieve. So in the work, I think, and this is actually, more a comment around, generationally being told that we should work for very large companies all our lives, and that's maybe what our parents were doing. And so I came out of universities thinking that was the only way to work. And then I think during the financial crisis, it hit a lot of people who were, young at the time during the crisis, that maybe these very large institutions didn't have it all right. They didn't know everything because we ended up in a financial crisis. And so I think that what really hit me from experiencing that on the trading floor is seeing a lot of, management and my mentors basically being as lost as I was. And it was a very humbling experience, I think, for them and for all of us to realize that it's not really about, being in a large institution or in a large organization. As in, if you're not doing your job properly, fundamentally, your life can really turn upside down very quickly. And so I think that from the moment that the financial crisis hit, don't get me wrong, I did very well in my career, and people actually, but when I was leaving, thought that it was a crazy move because, my generation of bankers has basically been almost exterminated in the industry, right? So all the kids that joined straight after the crisis, from Lehman to Merrill to any kind of bank, basically lost their jobs very quickly. I joined probably on the last boat, so just before the terrible things hit the fan. And so we saw the worst of it, right? And so we had to deal with a lot of the stress of trying to take the financial industry and put it back on track. And so I think that the reality around that timing in the industry is that things were actually quite stressful. It was very difficult to be creative. Because you had to basically look at a sector where the margins were becoming very small, and where you could just be treated that's completely dispensable, almost arbitrarily. And I think that for me, career-wise, I felt at some point, well, I know I'm good, because if not, I wouldn't still be in the industry. I know that, you know, I've been doing very well with my career, but maybe there's something more I could do if I was outside without the limitations of having to deal with a lot of the, you know, the bureaucracy, the burden, I guess, that being in a large organization requires. And so when we had this idea, I remember, you know, actually we could have started something like that within our organizations, right? So I could have started this within the organization I was working with at the time, and basically run like the tech project for the innovation on that piece, for example. But I remember, you know, knowing from my own internal experiences already that the industry was not in a place where it was going to be promoting entrepreneurship. And so the DNA of the industry is changing, but fundamentally because of the small margins and the situation that we're in, it's not that easy for people within organizations to be creative and to really, you know, be able to have the space that learning, you know, that innovation requires for learning and understanding, and, you know, learning and failing and doing that at a very fast speed, and really thinking about like an MVP and all of that stuff. So the agility, obviously, that starting your own company gives you is quite dramatic. And so when it came down to it, I had been thinking for a long time that I wanted to do something different. And so I know a lot of people say, oh my God, you must have been so brave to leave your job to do this. But, you know, by the time I left, it felt very right. It didn't feel like it was from one day to the other. It felt like I had been thinking about it for a long time. The idea had been matured. I had probably been working on it for about a year. And actually I left, you know, in a really nice manner, where my organization actually put me into the Barclays Accelerator. So it was kind of like a first class ticket to entrepreneurship. And I'm always very grateful for my managers at the time for signing that off, actually, because it was not, it was not something they had to do, but they effectively signed off for me to leave the bank under the umbrella of the accelerator that they had just started to run, basically.
Wow, what an amazing story. You saw a need, you jumped in head first, and then you also got the support of your, you know, big, strong name from previous workplace you were at.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a bit more about your co-founder?
So my co-founder, so he's the CTO in the business, I'm the CEO. And so I guess what's interesting when it comes to obviously finding a good co-founder is that you need to be complementary, right? And so it's, I think, so I'm technical enough to be able to know if the team are messing me about on something, but obviously it's not something that I like business a lot more than being technical. And so I think that having someone that's complementary to your skills is really important. So for anyone out there that is looking at starting a business, I would recommend you to find someone that can basically do all the stuff that you don't want to do, or that you don't like doing, or that more importantly, you're not good at. Because it's actually quite important to have that support. And at the beginning, above all, when it's just, you know, you and your founding team, you need that support to make sure you're not crazy, right? Because it's very different now when you have clients and things are going well and you're growing the business and all of that. But at the time, you can be very alone. So having a good team and a good founding team and a good co-founder are really essential to make sure that you can drive and execute something to completion.
And also, I'd like to hear about the name as well. I will pronounce it Suade, right? The Italian way.
Yeah, well, you know, it actually comes from Latin. It comes from suadere, and it means, you know, like suggesting, explaining, persuading. And so I remember we were looking for a name for the company because we had a meeting, actually. So we had like incorporated, but we were not sure if we were going to keep the name or not. And finally, my co-founder basically came up with that name. And in one of the first contracts we signed, which basically came after that meeting, was kind of the consequence of that initial meeting we had. The client actually said in the exchanges of emails that they had been persuaded. And I was like, I love this, we're keeping this. So it's been trademarked and all now. But that's what we've been doing, right? We've been explaining, suggesting, persuading the industry that things had to change, right? And we've been doing that in three-dimensional in every bit of work we've been doing. So I think that it's you know, if anything, entrepreneurship is about persuasion. So I'm very happy to have that as part of our name, basically.
Interesting. Thank you for sharing. Diane, back to you.
Sure. So before we get into the tech, which I really want to hear about, wanted to get an idea of your client base first. Who's your ideal client? How does your current client base look like?
Yeah. So when we started the business, we thought that this would be more appropriate for more like, you know, tier 2, tier 3 type banks, challenger banks. Because obviously my co-founder and myself, we come from large organizations. So we were thinking that's going to be very hard to disrupt. And the need must be, you know, bigger in the smaller entities. But then what happened very quickly is that actually large banks were approaching us saying that they had very similar problems, and fundamentally it's, you know, the problem around basically absorbing the regulation and then doing an output was done still quite manually because it required so many people. And so I think that we realized that the opportunity of bringing our technology to, you know, large banks was definitely there. And so our client base is extremely varied. So we have like tiny banks, like literally challenger type new banks in the market. And we have large tier 1 banks as clients as well. And the size of data they manage is very different, but they're all using the same software. And that's something we really pride ourselves in. So our ideal customer is independent of size, because we can actually cater to any size, and we have basically the same software for everyone. But, you know, like an ideal customer is obviously more around, you know, the sponsorship of at the right level for innovation, right? So if you don't have that in any size of bank, it's a problem. And we are a very different kind of enterprise software solution than what people are used to. A lot of the manual things that people are used to, you don't do in our software anymore. And so sometimes, you know, we like to speak about, we're always speaking about like legacy technology, but legacy technology is never a problem, right? It's more legacy mentality, legacy people that can be problematic. And so if you don't have the right sponsorship from like an innovation perspective, or really the right commitment at management level to do things right, then that makes it more complicated to execute. Because what we're executing on is technology, but when you're having a more subtle explanation around why you don't have to, you know, do something in Excel anymore, that can be a bit emotional if someone is not on board. So I would say that my perfect customer is independent of size. My perfect customer and ideal customer is basically a financial institution with the right sponsorship at leadership level to power through powerful innovation, basically.
Yeah, interesting. That makes sense. The appetite for wanting to change, to improve. I mean, change is an emotional thing in general. A lot of people wouldn't like it, but as long as you have leadership that can push that sort of, you know, mindset internally, I can see how that's important. So okay, about the tech. So I'm seeing, or I'm hearing, you know, there's this black box regulation in a box that you install, and, you know, there you're good to go. And somewhat, you know, obviously I'm oversimplifying in multiples here. And then there's also that piece about data formatting, which is trying to standardize, you know, across the industry, I guess, what you call the FIRE format, financial regulatory format.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about the two and how, and basically what you offer as a company?
Yeah, sure. So I guess in the space that we operate, there is a reality that I mean, really all other solutions, but ours required quite a lot of manual configuration. And the configuration, like the regulatory configuration, is something that's done through, you know, a lot of costly implementations. They require a lot of mapping effectively between the bank and the solution. That's why you always hear of these implementations that never finish, and maybe someone bought software 1 year and then 3 years later they're gone and then the software is still not implemented and all of that kind of stuff, which is how traditional enterprise software works in our industry. So the reason that this happens, I think, is because, you know, if you look at how enterprise software usually operates, I mean, it's very old architecture. It's not really the most modern kind of architecture that's out there. And it's very much an approach that, you know, where the business model requires a lot of professional services to make it work. And so where the solutions make most of their money from implementation, not so much from the technology that they're licensing. So if you take then, like our approach was literally to do the opposite of that. So we wanted to create technology that would be, you know, easy to implement. I mean, we're looking and we're talking about basically like, you know, web browser containerized type architecture. None of it is revolutionary per se, but I think the realities of basically making those things available in the financial industry is actually quite rare, because of the way that traditional solutions have operated over the past few years. So if you think about the process of implementation for a solution like ours, it's like night and day to what people are used to. It's literally, you know, just opening up, you know, an image if you want. Obviously, it goes through all the processes of due diligence and security and all of the things that are required, but it's a very straightforward approach in terms of implementation. It's not the old school and bring you a CD with Windows and you have to kind of put it from one computer at a time. So one part is that. The other part is basically, obviously, once you have the software, you need to kind of do this integration at the data level. And that is done, you know, by taking this approach, this very disciplined approach of FHIR, which, as you were mentioning, is financial regulatory data model. And so what's interesting there is that, you know, it accelerates implementation like multiples, because we can basically do an implementation that is driven by the regulation, and that also has a schematic part to it. And so the data attributes are not just, like I was saying, defined from a legislative perspective, but they also map to something that is more a format about how the data would look within a database, basically. And it's like, you know, open source. All of those things make it that it's very accessible. It also means that, you know, if our clients want to do other things with their data or extract their data or play with that data, it's readily available, it's interoperable. It doesn't have a dependency on us as a vendor to do more with that data. And that's actually quite critical, because if you think about how the industry has operated in the past, you know, decades, for a bank or a financial institution to do anything with their data, they have actually quite a lot of costs from their vendors to unlock that data back out to them or to do anything with that data. And those are practices that we really think are appalling and have to change, right? So it should be easy to get your data back out. If you spend time putting data into a system, it should be easy to get it back out. And above all, with the regulatory constraints that we're in, accessibility of data is quite critical from like any financial institution perspective. So if you're supervised by a regulator, you have requirements that are really intense around accessibility to your data, being able to show that your data is something that you manage well, that you have, you know, like access to it easily if necessary, from, you know, GDPR to any kind of legislation. The regulators have been quite clear that they want, you know, good data management, basically. So any kind of enterprise software solution that doesn't promote accessibility to data, I think is just very antiquated to, one, what's possible in the market nowadays in terms of technology, but then two, to what is correct when it comes to the new regulatory requirements that we're encountering in the industry. There should be no dependency on a vendor to access back your data. So that's one point. And so then effectively the work that we've been doing around data for the past few years have obviously made us very, I guess, capable in our understanding of creating technology for granular data, which is why we have the most performance system in the market, which is why we can basically do a lot of things with that data. you know, from normalizing it to cleaning it to then, you know, putting it into a regulatory output. And so you were mentioning the box. So the box is basically a box of, like, you know, calculations if you want, and rules, and a toolbox basically. It's not a black box. We're actually very much against black boxes, because that's the opposite of what regulation is after. It's very much an open box. So our customers basically buy this open toolbox if you want. And there is, you know, all sorts of things that you can use it for, whether it is for standalone things or whether it is to configure things yourselves as well.
Perfect. I like that whole, it's not a black box, not a black box, it's an open box that encourages accessibility and granularity, where you can do a lot more with the data. So those, is that right? That those are the two key things that, you know, if a client uses a software, that's the benefit they would get from a regulatory perspective.
Yeah, I guess the transparency piece is quite critical, and I think that, you know, the auditability, transparency in any kind of regulatory software is very important. And so, you know, traditional software doesn't really promote that, because you have lock-in situations, you have lack of interoperability, all of those issues that I was mentioning before, which are really the opposite of what the regulation is trying to get us to.
Makes sense. And so what, I guess, I don't really know who do you have competitors out there?
All the large companies, well, I guess you have obviously the traditional, yeah, I mean, the competitors in our space are very traditional, old school vendors. So we don't really see them as competitors, to be fair, because what we do is so different. And it's very, very different in terms of, you know, implementation, in terms of the speed at which we get projects done, and basically the technology that we have built to turn the regulation into code that does not require this kind of like manual intervention, which they do. So yeah, I mean, your traditional guys, the usual suspects, I would say, from, you know, tech companies to, I guess, you know, like old school consultants and that kind of stuff, right? So our industry is full of that. Got it.
And you mentioned a few times about how the implementation phase, I guess, you know, being quick. How long does it take? Let's say, you know, you've done the whole process of sales, you've gotten the client to sign the contract, say I want the product, and then they happen to be, or they have completed the process of converting their data into the FHIR format. Now, what does it take then for the remainder steps to get implemented? Or what time period?
You're looking literally at, you know, like a couple of hours.
Oh, wow.
It's really very fast. It's very fast. So it's because it's like, again, there's no hard integrations, there's no dependencies on like third-party software. So it means we can just deploy the software, basically. In enterprise software, it's funny because it's a bit like it's like a mafia. You know, people have a lot of dependencies between the softwares that have been built over decades, right? So it's like, if you don't have this piece from that old school solution, then the rest of that piece doesn't work. And that's how you know, things have been operating for a long time. So that's why this idea of interoperability is actually quite critical, because then it allows new entrants to enter the market. You don't need to have, you know, a piece from an old school solution to make your software work. You know, I guess it's interesting because obviously, like at the beginning, a lot of that stuff can also come or look like requirements, but they're not. And so I think in general, an architecture that promotes, you know, interoperability and no dependency is actually quite important for the financial institutions as well. They really need to look at that very closely.
I have a question about
tech principles.
Dan, I have a question about the business model. I read that you didn't fundraise, you went straight into bootstrapping. Was that including also the part of the accelerator, or literally from day one you started with clients?
So in the accelerator, that was not necessarily giving us clients or, you know, actually investment either, right? So the way we did actually the Barclays Accelerator with Techstars, and we also did Microsoft Ventures. And in both of those instances, there was no equity involved, so we never got really like cash. We had a grant from the European Commission, which is how we started FIRE, and then the business is pretty much bootstrapped, which I think is something that, if you can, I would advocate to do, because it gives you a lot of freedom. And I think, I mean, it's funny because we had a lot of really great, like, first class advice when we started the business. And one thing that I would recommend any entrepreneur to do at the beginning is to just spend a lot of time asking questions, because also, like, once you start, it becomes harder, right, to pivot. You start, going in a certain direction, you start investing in a certain way. You obviously want to remain very nimble. But as I was mentioning before, we haven't really had to pivot because we've always wanted to do what we wanted to do. But before we started, we asked a lot of questions. And so going to other founders and really listening to their stories and the consequences of fundraising and what can happen on the back of that, and how it limits your freedom and all of that kind of stuff, I think is actually quite important. Because I think when we started, definitely the motto in the street was, always hiring, always fundraising. And so it was not the most popular move to basically go with an approach of like having very little money to start with and then, go for customers. But I still remember basically talking to some investors and feeling, well, I can either spend my time trying to explain to this person what RegTech is, and he's also telling me that RegTech is not a thing, and because at the time it wasn't. So I can either convince him, right, or I can spend my energy trying to put that passion into a customer. And so that's the call we made with my co-founder, that it was better to put the energy into a customer than talking to people that didn't really understand what we were doing, because there's a lot of detail. Like I was saying, there's a lot of nuances and niche things that are a bit difficult to explain to people who are not dealing with the problem directly. So I would say for enterprise software, it's something that I would always advocate. We often talk with my co-founder, so well, we'll do like post exit, and so I think we will probably like do the typical thing of having our own fund and invest in entrepreneurs. And I think that B2B entrepreneurs, like with a few ingredients, they're going to be a success no matter what. As in, basically, if you have even one customer, in the worst of cases, your investment will be a consulting company. In the best of cases, they're onto something that could basically be software that can be sold like cupcake. And so that's my point, is that in enterprise software, if you find a few good customers that are ready to work with you, and we did, which was obviously wonderful, you can go a long way before having to really think about fundraising or anything like that. And so it means that it allows you to have the flexibility and the freedom of making the right decisions in terms of your technology stack and that kind of stuff. It means that you can also be a very neutral voice in the industry, because then you're not in bed with anyone, basically. And I think it's particular to enterprise software, but it means that it's very possible. For consumer businesses, I think it's a bit trickier, because obviously you need market share to kind of make it. But enterprise software entrepreneurs in any sector, I think, can actually go a long way by MVPing with clients without having this situation where they have a dependency on investors. And I think, venture capital is an interesting sector. It maybe needs a bit of a revamping. It's not always the best terms for entrepreneurs. And coming from banking myself, and having met now so many entrepreneurs that are friends, and it takes a certain kind of person to stop everything and try to do something new. And they're quality people. Right, so entrepreneurs in general, by nature, are actually, I think most of them are good people, and they want to change the world, right? And so I find it always so sad that passion can be completely, evaporated if you take the wrong investor money, and you can end up not even having any say into your own company. And so I think that those kind of things and those kind of terms, which are basically the norm in a lot of venture capital conversations, are not really fair for the entrepreneur that puts their life on the line to try to start something. And that's also why I guess we were careful with it, because I kept thinking when we would go and talk to some investors, I was like, well, I'm the one that's going in the rain with my backpack and knocking on doors, and like, what do you know about what I do? So I think that there is that. I think that at the time it was not necessarily very popular, but now you are seeing a lot more articles about bootstrapping business up to a certain stage, and it's becoming a bit more of like a cool thing in Silicon Valley and all of that. And I think our experience is a precursor of that reality, right? That, if you want to call the shots in your own life, and that's why I left banking, right? If you fundraise too early, or if you do it not with the right people, you lose that freedom, right? You lose that passion and that momentum, which is the whole reason you started a business. And it doesn't happen all the time, but it does happen most of the time, statistically, from what you're seeing. And I think that sometimes even some businesses will survive even longer if they didn't have the pressure of some of the decisions they've had to do with certain investors. So I think choosing your investors well, to really, like, I know people say that and it sounds easy and it's like a luxury if you think about it, but the reality is that the reason that people say that is because things are rosy when you sign term sheets, but when things are bad, right, they can be really bad, and you can lose years of your life of energy in a business just because you're pushed to do certain things for people to get a quick
Very
buck back
interesting.
on your life.
Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that. We have taken a lot of your time. I'm done with questions. I'll hand it over to Diane. Do you have any question?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on what you said earlier, Diana. It sounded like there was a lot of passion there and wise words, very well said. It also sounded like you learned it the hard way, even though you didn't. You were fortunate enough not to. So yeah, I just wanted to share that reaction. But my next question for you, I guess, the one that I like to ask a lot of people, it has COVID-19 affected your business at all, positively, negatively?
Yeah, I mean, very fortunate that it hasn't. I think, tech companies in general are well set up to cope with the situation, probably better set up than a lot of other companies. If you put things in perspective around what's happening in retail and aviation and all of that, obviously, tech companies can breathe through this because we're set up to deal with remote working and all of that. I would say that it's overall been a positive impact in the sense that we've been able to hire quite a lot of people on the back of this as well. We actually have quite a lot of people on the pipeline that we can hire, because obviously it's not gone super well for everyone under COVID. So we've been trying to take advantage of that. I think so we've been able to capitalize on the fact that we don't operate like a traditional vendor. So for a lot of our customers, they've basically been like, wow, you guys are like, operating like BAU, whereas all the guys we usually have to have on site from, these vendors are, they can't work on site anymore, right? And so they're just not used to being able to continue things the same way if they're not sitting next to people in an office. So overall it's been positive. I think that where it will impact things is obviously more on like I guess, new businesses, the events. There's like a roadshow of events that we're used to speaking at that obviously, things right now are very uncertain as to whether they're happening or not. I've had to cancel my, traveling schedule heavily, which I'm a bit like Stefano. I kind of travel all the time everywhere. And that's just been insane to cancel all of these trips. I tend to be even sometimes in several countries on the same week, right? And so all of that means that you're losing the roadshow of events that you're used to expecting, which is also where you network with people and things like that. But it's the time to upsell, right? So for anyone that's in business and that's doing well, the focus is on upselling on your current customers, which is not a bad thing to do. And I would say you were speaking about that passion from my fellow entrepreneurs. I think that's I think my biggest concern is that for businesses that are not well set up from a liquidity perspective, or then maybe we're looking at closing certain rounds and all of that. Like I'm just a bit more worried about our community of entrepreneurs being decimated on the back of this. So for a company like ours that's been around for a few years and we have customers and recurring revenue and all that kind of stuff, it's like, it's a different game, right? But if you're just starting or you counted on, a particular round to close and it's not going to close now, all of those things are just really sad. And I do feel passionate when I think of what I'm seeing in my founders chats or friends or people who are telling me that they have to think whether they keep their staff or they pay rent. Right. And so there's a lot of things that I think governments haven't really thought through as to what the impact is for smaller businesses and, SMEs and even tech companies, and what it actually means, this COVID situation. Right. So I'm not sure how it would be if we had to deal with this in 2014.
Another question, sorry if I jump in. You shared earlier before we started the recording that you are a mother as well and you're traveling.
Yeah.
How do you manage to get the two things to work together, your busy business schedule and being a mother as well?
So I take her with me pretty much everywhere. She comes with, I'm serious actually, like, for example, last year I was speaking at Sibos and I went with baby to that, Davos as well. She's been twice to Davos now. So she's not even 2 and she's done 2 years in a row of Davos. I take her with me a lot actually. I think it's been actually, I've had a wonderful maternity situation because I'm the boss in my company, so I can kind of do whatever I want. But this is also something that I advocate a lot. I do think that we have to kind of change society for it to work for mothers in general, right? So the reason I've had such a good maternity is because the first year, baby was with me in the office. And I had a nanny that had to be with her full time because it's a full-time job to take care of a baby. Yes. But I was able to go to a meeting and come back and play with the baby and then go back to a meeting and come back. And so that, for me, who loves my job and I love what I do, allowed me to go back into work at my own pace. And I think that freedom is something that should be mandatory for any kind of civilized society for all women and all parents. So I think we've ended up in a situation where we've kind of designed society to work for, working men. It's not very well set up for working moms and working fathers. And I think we need to change that and really take a good look at ourselves for that.
Thanks for sharing that.
Of course, my pleasure.
Brilliant. Stefano, should we close out?
Sure, we have taken so much of the time. It's wrapping the hour now, and perhaps you can take advantage of the last minute to talk to our audience, whoever is sitting in our audience. Who would you like to leave the last message with, and what would you like to say to them?
Yeah, sure. So I say thank you everyone for listening. If I can leave people with a message, it would be the one of, sometimes in life, you wonder whether you should be doing something or not. And really the risk of not doing something and regretting it is always much bigger. So whether it is to work with an entrepreneur or to be an entrepreneur, to be an intrapreneur within your organizations, I would say just do it, because in the worst of cases, you'll learn something. In the best of cases, you'll be really good at it and you'll love doing it. So you can't really lose when you learn more about yourself.
That was amazing. This was Diana. You say Diana or Diana? How do you pronounce her name?
You can do Diana.
Diana Paredes from suade.org or suade.org. Thank you for being with us. It was really, really fantastic.
Thank you so much, guys. I had a great time and wishing you the best of luck in the countries you're in. And hopefully at some point we get to meet in person.
Of course. Thank you.
Have
a great day.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.